JavaScript session share. Yeah, we're going to record this session. Got two papers who have their own dedicated time, but there might be some synergies and some links that we can draw together as well. So that's why we're going to try and keep it quite tight. So I'll introduce first of all Penny. Penny's going to go first. Penny is associated with Diggers and Dreamers, and she's going to be speaking about co-living, which is to some extent a contested form of intentional community, and that would be her paper. And I have just purchased the book Urban Communal Living, which has got edited by Penny and has a section on co-living in it, so you might be interested to know about that. So Penny, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to spotlight you, if that's hopefully, or actually, Sally, you're going to do that, are you? Okay. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. The floor is yours, Penny.
Thanks very much, Helen. Okay. All right. I've got some slides to share with you all. It's a pleasure to be here this morning with you all. And yeah, hope you find my presentation interesting. Okay. So as Helen said, my name's Penny Clark. I'm part of an organisation called Diggers and Dreamers, which is a UK-based online platform and publisher. And what we do is we support and advocate for types of communal living in Britain. And to be clear, my role with Diggers and Dreamers is actually a voluntary one. It's a small organisation. And my day jobs, I have two part-time roles. So half of the time I work in the co-living sector, which is the thing that I'm talking about today. And then the other half of my time, I work in a postdoc role with a focus on net zero and climate adaptation policy. So the paper that I'm drawing from today, as Helen mentioned, is one of the articles from the Diggers and Dreamers recently published books, Urban Communal Living in Britain, which has lots of articles about different urban living typologies, including co-ops, house shares, squatting, co-housing, amongst other topics as well. So if you're interested in the book at the end of this talk, I can post a link in the chat. Though unfortunately, I should note that we only deliver to the UK, I'm afraid. But if there is enough interest and demand for an online, an ebook version to be published, then yeah, I can always pass that on. Okay, so just a foreword about the topic that I'm covering today. So I'm looking at a commercial iteration of communal living called co-living. And in a way, it's a funny topic to cover at this particular conference, because to be honest, I wouldn't really call co-living a type of intentional community, though you could probably have quite an interesting debate about it. So considering that, why is it that I'm covering this topic? In part, co-living, I think, has its roots in intentional community. So I think it's interesting to see how, as a typology, it's evolved, especially since it's something that's on the rise and growing rapidly. And my experience of the sphere of intentional communities is that either co-living isn't really known about, or it's regarded with quite a lot of skepticism. So I wanted to bring this as a topic to the conference to just shed a bit of knowledge and awareness that this is something that is happening, and have a bit of a discussion about what to make of this happening as well. So firstly, for those of you who may not be familiar with co-living, I'll share a bit about what it is and what types of co-living we tend to see. So co-living can be defined as managed, usually rented accommodation. It's typically for profit, a commercial enterprise, where residents rent out their own private space but share communal areas. And there's this emphasis on this idea of community. Most co-living spaces will have one or more staff with a job title that's something like host or community manager, who have a responsibility to look after residents and facilitate social connection. Convenience is a highly important part of co-living, with residents able to sign up for short-term, so-called hassle-free contracts with one fee encompassing rent and utilities, as well as opting in for extra services, such as room cleaning. So how co-living spaces are designed and operated differs, though there's a few loose categories which most will fit into, and I'll take you through some of the key ones now. So the first I'm going to mention, I'm referring to as large-scale purpose-built co-living. And this category of co-living includes buildings which house anything from 80 to 500 plus residents. So some can be really large scale, and they're often purpose-built. Residents' private space usually consists of a studio apartment and they'll have access to extensive shared amenity spaces. Amenities will often include things like laundry, shared kitchens, social spaces, and a front desk. And there might also be things like a gym, a co-working space, a games room, an exercise area, even things like a cinema room, a bar, a restaurant, or an on-site shop. And there'll be an extensive roster of events and services which will include cleaning and a concierge very often. Another categorization is what I've referred to here as mid-scale co-living. So this consists of buildings which are more on the scale of 20 to 80 residents. And these residents will either have studios or shared flats. And as with large-scale shared living, there are shared amenities and events, but usually these are scaled down, considering, you know, you're operating from a smaller building. Then we have what I've referred to as networked homes. So networked homes are in essence a group of HMOs, which is an acronym, a UK acronym for houses of multiple occupation, or they might be flat shares. And typically they're scattered across a city, or maybe even a country, or maybe even countries. And usually co-living operators will enable and encourage their residents to move easily in between these properties if they would like to. And they'll also link the properties together mainly through a strong brand identity and through the occasional event, for example, drinks on a Friday or the occasional potluck. So in these properties, residents will have a private bedroom. They'll sometimes, quite often, have a private bathroom, but otherwise share all other spaces. And in what is essentially a house or a flat share, in calling it co-living, operators are expected to provide a certain level of convenience and service. So for example, you know, having one fee for everything, rent and bills, having a high spec design, high quality communal areas, and in some cases, enabling current residents to have a say in who moves in next. In terms of sheer volume of operators out there, digital nomad co-living is probably the most popular type of co-living. So this type is aimed at location-independent workers, the so-called digital nomad, who might spend some or all of their time moving between different countries. These places are usually quite small scale, 20 to 35 residents is quite normal, and residents might have their own rooms or they might share with others hostel style. And this type of co-living evolved from and intersects with the hostel model, though it's more catered towards residents staying for a longer period of time, but still quite short term. We're talking weeks or months typically. There's an emphasis on residents getting to know one another, spending time together and engaging with the local community. And then this type of co-living, this is the last one I'll specifically mention. And honestly, it's not very common, but I think it's a really interesting one, so I wanted to bring it up. So pod co-living. Pod co-living takes the concept of minimizing private space and maximizing shared space to a greater extreme. So co-living residents have their own bed space in a shared dorm. It's sometimes this kind of enclosed pod, and otherwise they share spaces with other residents. This model's emphasis, unsurprisingly, is on affordability, and it might be more transient than co-living communities that have greater levels of private space. The example on the screen here is an interesting one. This is a company called Upstart, and it's designed for aspirational artists and creatives in Los Angeles. So the rent that they have there is about half of the average rent when compared with other homes in the same area. And the houses have shared facilities which are helpful for creatives in their kind of early stage careers. So for example, dance studios, recording studios, printers, instruments available, etc. So as I said, I'll stop here, but this is not a non-exhaustive list in terms of types of co-living that you see out there. So you can add on to their co-living aimed specifically at older people, hybrid model co-living that combines co-living with hotels and student accommodation. And very rarely I've heard of co-living aimed at families or single parent families, at those with learning disabilities, and also models which explore fractional ownership. So that's an overview of what co-living looks like. So I'm going to talk a bit about where co-living came from. So it isn't known where the term co-living first came from, as far as I know, though it's widely accepted that it's intertwined with this concept of co-working. And a number of journalists and online writers attribute the emergence of the term to so-called hacker houses in San Francisco. In case anyone hasn't heard of hacker houses before, These are house or flat shares in which fledgling tech entrepreneurs live in close quarters to save on rent costs while attempting to get their startup enterprise off the ground. And it's expected that you live quite cheaply, and you also support each other in the process. And it's believed that co-living emerged from this hacker house concept to solve this problem of prospective renters who were moving to expensive cities where they didn't know many people. So while co-living has always been commercial, as far as we can see, its origins appear to be grounded in this kind of rough and ready form of intentional community that in itself is centered around commercial ambitions in creating a mutually supportive environment for professional growth. In terms of when co-living began, we can get a clue here from looking at Google search terms. So it was being used now and again, apparently as far back as 2004, but you can see it's 2015 when this term really started taking off and being used, at least online. So a quick word about the money in co-living, which is a really big part of it. There's a lot of investor interest in co-living, as this is high density living, which has appealing yields as a result. I've got a couple of facts there up on the slide, which I'm afraid are very UK and Eurocentric, just to illustrate this point. Investors are by nature cautious, especially larger institutional investors, and it's still early days for the sector, but you can see there that there's certainly large amounts of interest already happening, and investment continues to grow. And as a result, the kind of co-living, of all the different typologies that I showed you on these slides earlier, the kind of co-living that I see gaining momentum are these large scale schemes, which are going to be of more interest to investors. Co-living is on the rise in the UK. So there's about 3,500 beds in the UK in total at the moment, as far as it has been counted. But you can see there's a lot more that are actually in the pipeline and on the way to being constructed. And I wanted to show you some more international statistics. I'm afraid this is now a bit out of date. It's pre-pandemic, but I just wanted to give you a ballpark idea of the kind of numbers that we're talking about. So you can see that in the UK and in Europe, we're still talking about tens of thousands. But actually, in some places in Asia, in China, in India, co-living is very common. All right. So co-living, it is a controversial form of housing, and in my view, it has some problematic elements, and it also potentially has some positives as well. So for this last half of the presentation, I want to discuss this question of the promise of community in co-living, which I think is a particularly interesting one. What does community mean in this commercialized context? What doesn't it mean? And given this, what can we begin to make of it? And before I get started, I'd just like to caveat that I'm going to make generalizations in this next sector. But of course, different co-living businesses can look extremely different, especially when it comes to community. There are some that do look very close to intentional communities, and there are some that are more or less hotels that are called co-living. So my generalizations are based on what I observe as most common in the sector. So co-living promises community, and in fact, packages community as part of the service that you buy when you pay that all-inclusive fee. And arguably, community as a service, a phrase that's sometimes bandied around in co-living, is an oxymoronic phrase, as a customer pays to receive something versus a community member who in a communal living situation might be expected to, yes, receive, but also contribute themselves in a much fuller sense, giving time, work, energy, care, etc. So arguably, there's this inherent tension between the idea of customer and community member. And what co-living offers is community with much of the work taken out of it. So no administrative management for residents, no dealing with splitting bills, events that you know will still happen even if you don't show up, and that you can dip in and out of if you want to. So it does offer this kind of opt-in community. There's not many studies yet into co-living at all, and in particular into community and co-living. But one of the few that exists reflects this view of co-living as opt-in in a positive light. So this was a small-scale study into digital nomad co-living. Researchers interviewed 12 residents of a digital nomad community and found that co-living creates countless opportunities for human connection and friendships to flourish, and that residents were able to form a fluid community with users being able to join in and leave based on their personal schedule and also on the rules of each co-living space. Other studies have tended to focus on loneliness and social connection in co-living, though it should be said here that these studies have tended to come from co-living operators who we can't ignore have an incentive to foreground the positive parts of what they're doing. So on the screen here, we have an Israeli / American operator then who found that their residents' loneliness levels dropped by 50% 6 months after moving in, and that 100% of then residents felt socially supported. We've got a Spanish operator, Urban Campus, who reported that 85% of their residents felt less alone thanks to their community. And a recent report by a consortium of co-living operators, which found that 58% of residents felt closer to their neighbours as a result of co-living. So some interesting initial findings, but as I said, I think we can't ignore these come from operators, and I think certainly a lot more research is needed to really understand what community means. So I'd also like to think about community through the 3 types of sharing that Aronson identifies can enhance a positive and varied living experience of shared living spaces, which Helen Jarvis develops and uses in her article on the social architecture of co-housing. So here's number 1 out of 3, co-presence, which means simply and literally being together, which Aronson says can diminish feelings of isolation, enhance feelings of security, and help with establishing a sense of social identity. So in terms of whether co-living fulfills this, here I'd give a cautious yes. There's not a lot of data out there on how much time people spend together. There's some clues. So a self-reported survey from 5 co-living operators, which span 5 countries, found that 68% of respondents said the thing they most valued about co-living was the communal spaces. And of those, 77% of respondents altogether from that research said that they used the communal spaces, which suggests that co-presence is somewhat typical. And anecdotally, this sort of fits in with what I found. I've visited probably around 20 to 25 co-living spaces in European countries. And when I've been there, I've seen it's normal for communal spaces to be used. For sure, that again, there's more research needed here. But I'd say as well, given the architectural design of co-living, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that all being well, there's going to be co-presence.
5 minutes, Penny.
Thank you. Okay, factor number 2, affiliation, which Aronson defines as social-oriented interaction, which has the purpose of companionship, social support, and learning and growth. Opportunities to socialize and do things together is facilitated by co-living operators who put on events. And speaking of learning and growth, those events, it's quite common for them to include things like volunteering opportunities, career growth events, well-being oriented events. I want to bring up something anecdotal here. A community manager said to me quite recently, "We'll never be the cool kids." And what he meant by that is that because they're always the ones organizing the fun, if you like, they're always going to be a bit set apart from the residents because of this kind of professional role. And we were talking about this specifically in relation to events, and what he was getting at, and kind of my understanding of the social dynamic in co-living, is that these organized events are there to help residents break the ice and get to know one another. But in the end, it's my belief that the depth of companionship and social support has to happen independently of that, or kind of on top of that. So operators set things up, and then the idea is that community takes on a life of its own. And there are some mechanisms in place to help with this type of resident engagement. For example, operators encourage residents to run their own events. Sometimes they set aside a budget for them to do it, though this potential for affiliation has limits as well. So Helen, in her 2015 paper, which is talking about co-housing communities, talks about the depth of affiliation that can occur in more intentional communities, which is evident by the way in which some communities have a core set of agreed upon values. And typically there's not this depth of affiliation in co-living. But when I think looking at Aronson's definition, I think it is possible for co-living to achieve social-oriented interaction. And there's some indicative research that I shared earlier on loneliness and feelings of social support, which shows that this kind of thing may be occurring. And finally, the 3rd type of sharing is instrumental sharing, which Aronson describes as task-oriented interaction or object exchange, which has the purpose of easing individual efforts with domestic activities and increasing the number of amenities that one can have within financial limitations. It's certainly true that in co-living, there are economies of scale in sharing, which means that it's likely residents can access amenities and activities that they couldn't afford alone. So, for example, a swimming pool or cookery classes. When it comes to easing individual efforts for domestic activities, however, this is something that's taken on by the operator. So examples of this include cleaning services, a concierge, managing utility bills, organising social events. And this element of convenience is highly valued by residents, though in terms of community forming, perhaps something is lost here. So Helen talks about the value of the sociality of work, which enables the creation of rituals that can be performed and endowed with a sense of occasion in co-housing communities. She shares that, collaborative work can form a key element of community. And in co-living, this opportunity doesn't exist, at least not in the same way. So co-living residents do have less domestic work than the average household, but this is not through collaboration. So I don't think that co-living fulfills this third category of our ensigns, at least certainly not in the way intended. And a topic that I also want to bring up in relation to that is power. Being free from the responsibility of work and having to collaborate to split bills and to do maintenance also means a lack of control over that process. So like many things I'm talking about today, I think there's an interesting research topic in this, and this is just my kind of take on it. So I would say power is given to residents in limited ways, and it's mainly based on the power that customers have, which is essentially being able to make complaints, being able to give feedback individually, and ultimately voting with your wallet. Beyond that, there are some limited mechanisms for making your voice heard collaboratively. Having town halls in co-living is not uncommon, as is being represented by a resident ambassador, maybe being able to ask collectively for particular things. So just to give a kind of banal example, people using one kitchen ask, can we get a blender for our kitchen? And also perhaps having kind of the tech platform that is common in co-living does make it easy for this kind of collaborative communication with residents. But overall, I think a particular thing to note about co-living communities is that I wouldn't view them as communities of collective empowerment and autonomy. Okay, so I'm going to round up here. I think there's many more fascinating topics about co-living and what to make of it. And I've just kind of touched on one today. But I think to me, the really interesting topics center around the commercialization, which sits at its core, its scale, what that means, its design, its potential for sustainability, which was an initial interest of mine. And also its reframing of sharing as aspirational to a different audience when compared with your typical intentional community, if such a thing can be said. I've probably come to the wrong place to say that. So this is an emerging field of research with many big gaps. But just to finish off by rounding up on this particular discussion, co-living offers this version of community which sits within the boundaries of a mainstream capitalist system, and it answers the needs of the mobile worker who's money rich and time poor, ultimately helping them to participate in a modern mainstream economy. Having said that, I think there are positives to be taken from co-living too. It's positive to see a relatively mainstream form of housing, which acknowledges directly that we have social needs. And not only that, that although it sits in this capitalist framework, it's still subverting this housing norm that we should aspire to privacy and ownership, instead emphasizing sociability and experiences as the things which have the greatest value. And in a climate crisis where we do have a very limited amount of time to make rapid changes, in my view, co-living, if done well, takes a step in a better direction than the current values of mainstream housing and offers a solution that can move at scale and at pace, given our current economic and cultural paradigm. Okay, thank you for listening, and yeah, happy to take any questions and have any discussions. And my email is there if you'd like to get in touch.
That's great. Thanks, Penny. We've got I'm going to keep we've got 3 minutes to think question, but that's okay. I mean, Yeah, because we do have the hour, just the hour, but yeah, open this up to questions. You can put some questions in the chat if you feel that they may need Penny to come back to you by email, but it'd be nice to have a couple of thoughts or questions for Penny on this.
It was interesting for me to hear it because now in Israel there is co-living in hotels because people were evacuated from their houses in the north and the south, and they live 3 months together with laundry and food and all the things that you mentioned. So it was very interesting for me to hear about your research and think about how it happening in the hotels now, and that we didn't believe that it will be co-living in hotels, but it's a very interesting phenomenon.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
That's interesting. I'm sorry, Chair Frog, to jumping in. It's interesting there because we sometimes talk about there's quite a lot of it, and this might connect to Ayala's paper. I don't know. I don't want to presume to make the connection, but we talk increasingly about retrofitting neighborhoods to be a bit more intentional and neighborly, and also about accidental communities. And I suppose in situations where you've got evacuations and I mean, in this happening in Iceland at the moment for different reasons, because that you have this sort of almost accidental bonding process that may or may not be supported by the infrastructure. I suppose what Penny's been presented is that there's the infrastructure there, but which interests me enormously because of the parallels with, yes, to what extent do you need it to be conscious and intentional by collective, or does it need to be conscious by benevolent state or a benevolent actor? Are there any thoughts or questions?
May I ask a question, please? Thank you, Penny, for your presentation, but I wonder where is the family in your presentation? It is a very individualistic approach. I did not see children or many children. I did not see several generations. And could you enlighten us about family life, if there is any?
Yeah, that's right. No, thank you. I think that's a good observation. So co-living, the kind of typical person who lives in co-living is a young professional. So usually sort of anywhere from early 20s to mid 30s. And co-living, I think the people that it really serves are people that are going through moments of life transition. So that might be starting a new job. It might even be, you know, a relationship breaks up, or sometimes it is people at a later life stage who enter into co-living. So it might be they've retired, they got a divorce, the kids are left home. There's a moment of life transition, and people are seeking or needing to have a kind of safe landing pad in a new area, somewhere they can go if they don't really know anyone. They're in a place where kind of bills are looked after, living is simple, and they're living with people who at least have some interest in getting to know the people living around them. And I think for that reason, it's very rare to see co-living that's aimed at families. Anecdotally, I have seen it happen. A co-living operator had a couple of 3-bed apartments. They had 2 families in there. And they said the families actually really loved it because they could take their kids down to events and like let them loose a little bit and relax a bit because they sort of knew the other people there too. So it is something that's, I think, more appealing to people who don't have children or an extended family that they want to be around.
Thank you.
I'm going to close the questions now, if that's all right. And maybe if there's enough time, we can come back to any connections and synergies after Ayala's paper. But I really want to turn to our second paper now to give space to that. Ayala, over to you. Oh, sorry, I should introduce because we introduced it at the beginning. And we have a couple more people in the audience as well. So Ayala's from Israel, going to be focusing on ethnically diverse neighborhoods of Jerusalem. I'm going to be talking about patterns of place and community attachment. I won't say more about yourself. The biographies are available on the website because I don't want to cut into your speaking time. But as with Penny, I'll give you a 5-minute warning if that's all right. If you can sit within 25 minutes the maximum. Then we have a few minutes for some questions. That'd be great. Okay, I'll let you share your slides now. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And again, people can use the chat if you have any questions.
Okay. Okay, you can see my
That's good.
slides.
We can see it. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So good morning. I'm delighted to present my research findings on the subject of patterns of place and community attachment in an urban neighborhood in Jerusalem, Israel. The research was conducted by Professor Edith Blit-Cohen from the School of Social Work at the Hebrew University, who cannot be here today, and by me. I'm a PhD student at the School of Social Work at the University of Haifa. Okay, so first of all, I will introduce myself. Besides being a PhD student, I'm also lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I'm the CEO of Shepherd Association for Loneliness in the Old Age. And I'm a community social worker for over 20 years by now. So I always, I love to work and be in the field and also research. And why are we interested in exploring what a community is in a city? So I will tell my own story, why I started to research this subject. My search for understanding what constitutes a community began with my personal story. I was born and raised in a very small community on a hilltop kibbutz in northern Israel called Ma'ale Gilboa. It consisting of 40 families, very, very small. This community resembled an extended family, where everyone cared for one another. However, at the age of 20, I moved to the bustling city of Jerusalem, and this transition from the village to the city became the focus of my current inquiry. It prompted me to reconsider the concept of community and strive to comprehend how it manifests in a large city with 1 million inhabitants, from 40 families to million. My research delved precisely into this juncture, how individuals perceived and comprehend the notion of community in an urban setting. So I will introduce a theoretical background, the methodology and findings and implementation. So first of all, the background to my research was urbanization process and how it challenged the essence and meaning of the community for residents living in the city, and also for professionals involved in community development in cities, and how it required to develop tools and skills adapted to urban community work. I think it's especially important in Israel because Israel was a very tiny and community place, and the urbanization process is kind of new in Israel. It's like to have such large communities, it's a challenge here. And now in Israel, 92% of Israel's population lives in city, and only 8% live in small kibbutz or moshav or stuff like that. And 54% of the world's population, it's going to increase in recent years. So in my inquiry, I discovered the theory of place attachment. And I felt this theory is really the best way for me to investigate, because it's theories that combines place and community together, the physical place and the emotional and the community, all of this together. So Scannell and Gifford and Altman and Lowe are the scholars that very known with this field of place attachment. And it is an emotional relationship that people develop toward a certain physical environment where they tend to stay and where they feel safe and at peace. This environment gives them a sense of belonging, which is necessary for their psychological well-being and depends on strong relationships with those that surround them. The environment also helps its residents realize their day-to-day goals. So place attachment is based, this psychological concept is based on the attachment theory, which is a very internal theory between a baby and his mother, developed by John Bowlby from the years of 1969. And it's emphasized 4 psychological processes that characterize attachment relationships: closeness, safe haven, safe base, and separation distress. So Bowlby was talking about how a baby is attached to his mother and how this is the most important thing for developing. And for me, it was interesting because when I discovered place attachment, for me, as growing up in a kibbutz, a very small community, I felt that it's not only my connection to the mother that helped me to develop, but my connection to the community and my connection to the place. And a place attachment speak about it, how people are not only influenced by their mother and father, but also by their surrounding community, especially people who lives in a community. And also the place, the physical place and the surrounding, how it affects us. And during my inquiry, I also thought about attachment theory, about the patterns of Ainsworth. Ainsworth was also a psychological scholar that continued the theory of Bowlby, and she discovered 3 patterns of attachment between baby and his mother: a positive attachment, ambivalent or negative attachment, and avoidant attachment. And it was interesting for me to inquire if these patterns also happens between a person and his community or person and place. And that's how I went to my research. Everybody in the field of community knows a sense of community of Saracen, which speak about cognitive structure, socially oriented, pertains to social relationships among the residents. So sense of community is really about belonging and people-to-people connections. And place attachment also bring to the table the spatial physical orientation. And there's a lot of scholars that speaks about how important it is to research this field of community by combining the physical and the social structure. So Plunkett and Mahmoudi Farahani and Manzo and Perkins, all of them speak about how both concepts express psychological dimensions that relate to beliefs and feelings about neighbors and other residents in the neighborhood, which may be valuable for communities of place. So this is a theoretical background, and this is my questions, research questions that went to the, I started the journey of research with them. So what is a community for people living in a neighborhood in a city, a very large neighborhood in a very large city? What are the perceptions of the residents regarding the social aspects in the neighborhood? And what are the perceptions of the residents regarding the role of the professionals in the city as social workers? So the methodology were to go to a neighborhood of Pisgat Ze'ev and interview 15 people aged 25 to 55. And we didn't want people that are religious and go to synagogue or have a very strong community. We went to people who are not religious, not connected to a community, because we really wanted to know how secular people non-religious people perceive community. The article based on a qualitative narrative study, and it included a semi-structured in-depth interviews with 15 residents. This is a neighborhood, Pisgat Ze'ev. It's one of the largest neighborhoods in Jerusalem. It has 45,000 residents. And as you can see, it's on the side of the desert. From one side, there is an Arabic village, very big neighborhood. And from the other side, there is a very big ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. And in the middle, there is Pisgat Ze'ev. It's like a suburbs because it's not in the middle of the city. They can go to the big city of Jerusalem only by train or car. They can't walk to the center of the city. And here you can see some data about it. It was interesting for me to start investigating this neighborhood because I came and thought it's like a very big neighborhood and it can be a good sample. But also I discovered that in recent years, an ultra-Orthodox population has moved to the neighborhood as well as an Arab minority population. And this fact became the core of the study, as I will show you. So the findings, there were three central themes. The first one, we discovered that feelings about a place and the community are reflected in three different patterns of attachment. Like Ainsworth attachment theory, it also happened in Pisgat Ze'ev with residents that expressed positive attachment, negative or ambivalent attachment to the place, and avoidant attachment. I will show it soon. The second theme was that there was a relationship between the pattern of place and community attachment and the participants' responses to changes in their secure base, as reflected in demographic changes in their neighborhood. The secure base, I will show it at the next slides, because there was a very big demographic change going on in the neighborhood with the entrance of minorities from Arab minority and ultra-Orthodox to a neighborhood that is with not ultra-Orthodox and not Arab people, normally Jewish people, secular. So there was a big drama going on while I investigated this neighborhood. And the third thing I discovered was there was a previous communal experiences led to aspiration for actual replication of a community in their new residence and vice versa. I will demonstrate it. So the first theme was of the three patterns that I discovered, that there were three kinds of people talking to me in the interviews. The first one was avoidant attachment. These people has lack of emotion or feelings for the place and community. They said things like, I don't feel anything to the place I live in. I don't care living in anywhere else. If things get worse here, I will just move. No feelings. And also people told me, I don't want to feel anything for the place. I choose not to feel. I just live here because it's cheap and because the house is nice and that's it. I can live anywhere in the world also. So they dissatisfied with the population, no social connections in the neighborhood. They didn't look for social connections in the neighborhood. As a physical space, they said they're partially satisfied and did not express an emotional connection to a physical place in the neighborhood. And about the demographic change, they said they're threatened by the changes in the neighborhood and they are planning to leave the neighborhood. because of the changes. And the action strategies have not been involved in the past. They didn't want to be involved in the neighborhood, lack of belief in the ability to influence, very like keeping themselves not connected to the place. This is a type. The second type, the pattern, is negative or ambivalent attachment. These people say things like, I hate the neighborhood, but I still want to live in it. Something like they have emotions, but they're not necessarily good. They're like confused about it, ambivalent. So the social fabric also, they said, we are dissatisfied with the population. We are striving for neighborly and communal relationships. They're not satisfied, but they want connection. They want friends in the community, and they don't find. So they're like tearing apart from this in this neighborhood. The physical space also, they didn't like anything, especially in the place. Demographic change. They're threatened by the changes in the neighborhood. They are avoid due to the security situation and want to leave because of anxiety about the situation, yet stay. They're anxious, but stay. So when I told them, why do you stay? So they said, yeah, the house is cheap, my family live nearby, stuff like that, but they're not avoidant like the other patterns. They have feelings, but they're complex. And the action strategy, they are attempted to get involved in the past, but it didn't bear fruit and felt disappointed. Lack belief in the ability to influence. So
5 minutes, Ayala.
okay. The positive attachment was positive feeling about the place. I said, we're satisfied with the population. We're partly satisfied with the physical space, demographic change. They do not experience the changes to the neighborhood as a threat. This was the most interesting things in my research, because if people feel that they have friends and they have community and they love the population, so they didn't perceive the demographic change as a threat. And the action strategies, that desire for involvement or actual involvement, belief in the ability to influence. So this is like the structure, the emotion for the place with the 3 patterns, the physical space and the social space, the threat to their secure base by the demographic change, and the coping and action strategies. And this was the 3rd theme. I discovered that people that knew what community is, like me, that I came from a kibbutz to the city, I have the model of a community, how it looks. They also searched for community in the city or in the neighborhood, but people who didn't live in a community and didn't know what community is because they live in other neighborhood before that didn't have community, they didn't search for it. They just didn't know what it is. They asked me, what is a community? We talked about community a lot in our field, but they didn't know what it is, what it even means. I hear of it, but I never had one. I don't know what it is, like ice cream that I never tasted. So it was very interesting that people need to know and see community to want community. The expectation from social workers was, people said that they want this community in their dreams, like Bauman also talked about. Bauman in 2001 said, we seek in safety in an insecure world. So I really saw it happening in the city. People say they want safety, but they also want freedom. So they're all the time in this between these 2 spaces, and they look for the middle. And the conclusion and the implications, it really shows how it's impersonal to introduce a relationship between the theory of interpersonal attachment and the theory of place attachment. It contributes to understanding how perceptions of community and place are formed in a city, and the key role of community development social workers in an ethnically diverse community. It contributes to community development by exploring the impact of structural power differentials on urban communities, particularly those with high levels of ethnic diversity. And finally, it sheds light on the inequalities in social capital and group status that result from these power differentials and emphasizes the importance of cultural sensitivity in community development. The study highlights the need to address cultural and environment assets unique to the community, as well as equity issues and cultural competency. Thank you. Wait, I have a, okay. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you. It has been a pleasure to present this important topic concerning community development. And if you have questions, that's it.
That's great, Ayala, because you've lifted so that we've got a good sort of 6 minutes or so for questions and questions to Ayala, and any maybe connections to make between and Penny's raised her hand already. Yes, Penny, you've got a question.
Thanks. Thanks, Ayala. That was so interesting. And a really important topic as well. My question is, did you observe any particular demographic differences between these three groups of people who were, you know, kind of neutral, avoidant, negative attached, positive attached?
Actually, it's interesting. It's an interesting question because it wasn't a quantity research. It was also only interviews. So we didn't check the demographic changes and stuff like that. But during my interviews, I didn't see like any differences between women or men, or I didn't observe any. The only thing I noticed that people who said they have friends and community in the neighborhood say they're also a positive attachment.
Thanks.
Other questions or observations about the connections made in these two papers? Well, I'll use chair's prerogative again. Ayala, I was really interested in this idea that maybe growing up in kibbutz and having a personal story of a connection to a more extended kin network notion of community in place maybe made the primary carer role less significant in terms of traditional attachment theory. And I was wondering if it's something that, you went into the research with from, to make, I suppose, a positive connection to the sort of sociality and the collective of kibbutz compared to conventional neighborhoods. Are there any lessons there in terms of maybe designing conventional neighborhoods in terms of maybe drawing some of that sort of, it takes a village to raise a child, or sort of, a kind of collective notion of care and attachment? Particularly, I'm thinking in terms of, younger and older, across the care needs of the life course.
Yeah, actually, when you ask it, it's really my personal stories that my parents left the kibbutz when I was like 20 years old, but I have a brother that was 11 years old. And when they moved to another place, he really had like a depression, very big depression. And we went to a psychological or social worker, I don't know what she was, to a therapy, and she asked him about his mother and father and the relationship with the mother and father. And I told her, listen, it's not only the mother and father. He grew up in a kibbutz. It's also the community and the place. Maybe because I'm a community social worker, so that's how I look at things. And then she told him, she told me, it doesn't make a difference. People get adjusted. Children get adjusted. It doesn't supposed to cause a depression if you move from place to place. And then he was very mad at her and he went out from the room. And I told her it does make a difference because for him, the community was like a mother. And then she thought, okay. And she was ready to think about it. And then he went back to the room and she talked to him about the kibbutz. And he said, part of my rehabilitation is that I want to go back to the kibbutz and smell it and see it and remember. And it was part of the rehabilitation, really. And for me, it was very strong moment that I understood that people that live in small communities are connected to other things besides their mother and father. And I think there's not enough space for it in the psychological field, in the social worker field, that are very like Western or modern thinking about a little family that influence each other and not about communities that influence. So that was very important for me to delve into this research and find. And when I found this theory of place attachment, it was bingo, because that's what it talks about, exactly that. That when people leave spaces or places that they love, it's like a grief for people who they lost. I hope it answers your question.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, I could go a bit, but I don't want to take up the space that other people might have questions. It's very interesting that for what we need to focus on as planners and policymakers. Other questions or thoughts? We actually have just Penny's got a question. This will have to be the last one. Sorry, Penny, because we have actually come up to time. Penny?
Yeah, sorry. And also, if someone else had a question, I'm aware I've already asked one. Yeah, it's just really interesting what you said about your brother wanting to be there and smell and see the place. And I suppose I just wondered, when people spoke to you in their research, how did they talk about feeling attached to the place? Did they talk a lot about the kind of the sight, the smell, the sensation of being there? Or, you also mentioned that having friends in the place was important. Was that the thing they talked about the most? And so, yeah, it just made me wonder, do people get attached to the place and make friends? Or do they make friends and get attached to the place? Probably not as simple as that, but I'd be interested to hear your take.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it was interesting for me too. And in Pisgat Ze'ev, the community that I investigated, they didn't love the place so much. They said it, that they don't connect it to the place because it's not a very pretty or not a lot of green places in the community, in the place. But they did speak a lot about the public space and how it influences their identity. They said if we go in the neighborhood and it's dirty, we feel dirty. There is we feel that it's not what we want to feel because our house is very clean, and then we go out and we don't like what we see, and it influences our identity. And it was very interesting, the signs that they look like, if they see ultra-Orthodox signs that they don't feel attached to, so it gives them a notion that we want to go, we don't want to see it, we want to move to other community, other place. So they really, the sensors are very, sensors to the place are very influencing their personal identity.
That's interesting.
Let's thank. Sorry, we've had to run to close to time. And now we are going to go into a 15-minute break, but I wanted to just take this moment to thank both of our speakers. This was the first session, so we're launching the what is the 3 days of this conference. I think we've got off to an excellent start here. There will be parallel sessions again after the 15-minute break, and we'll all start to get to know how these things work. So just I'm not sure, we can't really applaud in the usual way, but we can sort of send our appreciation to the two speakers, and look forward to seeing you at other aspects of the other parts of the conference as well. Thank you very much. And hopefully people can keep conversations going by making connections virtually as well, this network. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.